This meeting is being recorded.
Got it. Thank you.
Got it.
Well, you want to get back to your guests, don't you, Barry? So
Yeah, in a minute. Yeah, we're just on 7:30 now.
yeah, have you got anybody in the waiting room?
No,
So we'll get going, shall we?
I'll mute everybody. So you'll have to. Oh, Kate's coming on. I'll mute everybody, and then you'll have to unmute if you want to talk. Okay. Mute all. Yep. Okay.
Right, I'm going to see if I can remember how to do this now. So I go to share screen, don't I?
Yep.
There it is. Can everybody see that? Can someone put their thumbs up if they can see that?
Yeah, I can see it, Mervyn.
Yeah, lovely. Okay.
I'll leave you to it, and I'll keep checking if there's anybody in the meeting room.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome to those couple of names I didn't recognize on the screen. Anne sent a message to everyone saying they were from Oxfordshire, so welcome to you. I'm just trying to think whether I actually saw any orchids in Oxfordshire. Yes, I did see some in Oxfordshire this year, I think. So you will have something to see from Oxfordshire. Before we get going, I should explain the title to start with. The reason, I mean, you probably just heard me talking to Ken, that I've put 50 or more native British orchids in a year rather than saying attempting to see all of the British orchids in a year, is that I knew it was going to be impossible to see them all unless there was an enormous amount of luck in seeing the ghost orchid. But I have, I think, unless some of you want to disagree with me later, seen all the full species in the UK in the past year, plus a new species which flowered this year. Some of you may have read in The Guardian and other newspapers about that. And I'll also be showing you something like 15 hybrids and a whole range of varieties as well. So I think it actually comes to about 75 that I saw. That doesn't compare with one person in the Hardy Orchid Society who managed to see 105 different orchids. But this is where the debate over species and subspecies comes in. The map on your right here, the blue hexagon here represents Gloucestershire, where if in the last few years I've managed to see all but one of the ones that flower in Gloucestershire, and I didn't bother trying to see them all this year because I knew I'd see some of them in other places, and the blue lines represent some of the trips that I went off on to see the orchids. In actual fact, you probably don't need to go to, well, in fact, you don't need to go to Scotland. You can see some of the ones that I went to Scotland to see in Cumbria. And in fact, the person that saw 105 in 2019 just did it in England and Wales. So that means he didn't get the couple that are only found in Ireland as well. And in fact, he caught up with them this year. He was in Ireland at the same time that I was. So this is basically where I went. What made me do it? Well, some time ago, I read these two books and thought, what a fantastic thing to do. Both of these authors saw all the British orchids that were flowering that year in the UK. This one by John Donne is an incredibly detailed book. And the one written by Leaf on the right here is slightly lighter reading. But again, both of them do include an awful lot of detail and knowledge about orchids, showing how incredibly well they've researched orchids. My researches were more about where I could find them and planning to go and see them rather than learning about the orchids themselves. So these two books were the inspiration for seeing them all. Other books that have helped with what I've done. This one was yet another book about seeing as many flowering plants in a year as possible. And of course, like all of us, he failed on this one that I'm circling here, the ghost orchid, and he called his book Chasing the Ghost. And in fact, if I go back here, oh, sorry, wrong way. John last year caused a bit of a stir when he posted a picture of a ghost orchid and said, finally caught up with a ghost orchid. And everybody wanted to know where it was in the UK. And it turns out that he was actually in Spain when he saw it. So, but it did cause a bit of a stir when he first said it. The names that I have used through my presentation are based on the latest knowledge of the classification of the orchids, and it comes from this book. And some of you will remember that Sean talked to us last year or the year before, I can't remember now. And this book, which has been around for a very long time, and in fact some of the names in it have changed now, and some of the places where they say you can see orchids don't have the orchids anymore. But this is still probably the starting point for planning anything. And then this website here on the right is a really, not website, sorry, it's a Facebook group, is a really brilliant place for talking to other people who are keen to see orchids and finding out where they've been seeing them and things like that. People don't actually tell you exact locations unless you get in touch and manage to convince them that you are not going to do any harm. But they do give you some idea of when things are flowering and when you should start going to look for them. And this one is one that I haven't included in my counting, which is why it hasn't got a number next to it. But this is one that flowered in Britain this year. It comes probably from a plant that was planted about 20 years ago, flowered for 2 years and then stopped, and everybody thought it had gone. And then this year, a young gentleman whose name escapes me for the moment, but I met him in the Chilterns. He found this flowering in Oxfordshire, and there were 8 or 9 plants there. Now this is a Mediterranean plant, and as you can see by the date over here, a friend and I and his wife went to see it on the 31st of March. And what was weird was that it was snowing the day we went to see it. In fact, it was quite a gale when we got there, and we were very fortunate that it actually stopped so that we could see the plants and take some pictures of them. And just to explain how some of these screens will look to you, each species is introduced with a page like this, with a full page, a full plant image, their English name, their scientific name, and the date that I saw it, and the number of the trip that I did. I did 43 trips during the 5 months of the orchid season to see orchids. Not all of them are numbered on here because some of them were just seeing things multiple times, so they don't all fit on there. And when we get to the genuine British species, there's usually a bit at the bottom of this left-hand bit as well, showing the number of times I saw it and the sites that I saw them in. I should also say at this point that this was never intended as a talk. This is purely and simply my electronic diary, if you like, and record of what I did in the year. So it remains to be seen how effective it is as a talk. Anyway, so that's the giant orchid, and this is what it looks like close up. It's in the same family as the lizard orchid. don't see a huge resemblance other than the fact that it has got this very long lip petal. Quite an impressive beast. It lives up to its name of giant orchid. It is quite a statuesque orchid with a very big solid stem, some big leaves, and these big flowers clustered together in this tight inflorescence. Anyway, going on, I started looking at orchids probably in the 1970s, and the first one I ever saw, in fact, was this one. Still my favorite orchid. I look forward to it every year, and this was the first year that it wasn't my first orchid. As you can see, I saw it on the 15th of April, and the giant orchid beat it. And to show you to the extent to which I go to make sure normally that this is the first one, that when we go to Durlston, I walk to an area of the country park where I know there are early purple orchids, rather than seeing the early spider orchids, which are what I've really gone there to see. But here it is close up. This one was on Minchinhampton Common, this couple here. I can't remember where this close up was taken. The real reason for going to Durlston, of course, is to see these, the early spider orchids. And as you can see down here, I only saw them in one place. I could have gone to see them in Kent, and I realise now that I should have, and I'll explain why when we get to the bit that's involved. I think these are absolutely stunning little orchids. And when I say little, I'm talking about a plant that is only 4 inches, 5 inches tall, quite often with only one flower, and occasionally, I think the most I've seen is something like 6 on the one stem. And there's huge variation in the patterns on their lips. I drive my wife mad because I tend to look at every single one and say, oh, I've got to get a picture of that. Oh, I've got to get a picture of that one. Come and have a look at this one. And she's usually sitting there reading a book, trying to ignore me completely. So, and the weird thing is, despite their rarity, when you're in an area where they grow in their thousands. So, but I really do like these. And also at Durlston on that first visit on the 15th, or the second visit on the 15th, there are some lovely green-winged orchids which grow on the cliff tops there as well. They don't look like this one here. They tend to look more like this. They're a bit more stunted, especially early in the season before they've grown any taller. But this one here, for example, was literally probably only 5 centimeters tall. And then when you get to places like Course Lawn between Newent and Tewkesbury, where literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of them grow, in a more normal situation for them, in a neutral hay meadow, they grow a lot taller, much more spectacular. And this is just showing you the range of colours that somewhere like Course Lawn will have. Wherever there are thousands of them, you will find a range of colours like these. But again, absolutely beautiful orchids. Now this comes in as my 4th orchid of the year. And normally it probably wouldn't be that early if I was just looking in Gloucestershire. But this trip here, my 4th outing, was probably my worst experience of the year. I woke up quite early, and I'd been thinking about going to see these fly cross woodcock orchids that are a well-known little colony just inside Dorset. And I woke up early and I said to my wife, oh, I can't get back to sleep now. I'm going to go and see these orchids. It'll take me a couple of hours or so to drive there. I'll have a look at them for half to an hour. Then I'll drive back. I'll be back in time for coffee. So I'm off. So I'm zooming down the motorway, and just past Bristol, a warning light came on the screen of my car. I didn't know what the warning light was, so I had to pull off the motorway, look in the book, and it said tire pressure down. So I drove to a garage, had a look at the tires, couldn't really see anything terribly wrong, put air in all of them anyway, reset the warning light, drove off. 2 minutes down the road back towards the motorway, warning light came on again. So I thought, oh, there's something wrong here. Went back to the garage, asked them where the nearest tire place was. They looked at me a bit strangely and said just down the road. And when I got down the road, I realized why they'd looked at me strangely, because it was still only 7:15 and the garage wasn't opening until 9. So I had to sit there until 9. When they opened, this was one of these chains, quick fit or whatever. I went in, said what the problem was, and they said, ever so sorry, we haven't got any appointments today. We only do tires by appointment. So I asked them where the next nearest place was, went there, told them what was happening with my car. They put it up on the jack, had a look. The chap said, I really can't find anything wrong. Come and have a look. And as he was showing me and he was spraying water on them, a few bubbles started appearing on one of the front tires. And he said, oh, perhaps you have got a problem here. And anyway, your 2 front tires are really worn out. I'm sure this is a quick fit line that they all say. Anyway, I got him to replace the 2 front tires, reset the warning light, charging off down the motorway again, and blow me, the light came on again. This time I ignored it, carried on to the road cutting where the orchids were that I wanted to see, saw them, reset the warning light, set off back, warning light comes on again. By now I'm thoroughly fed up with electronics, and so failed to take notice of what the sat nav was telling me. Got onto the motorway to drive back up the motorway and encountered stationary traffic. And I was sitting there for a few hours. Then in the end, I didn't get home till 4 o'clock, having expected to be back home by 11. But, however, that was more than made up for by the fact that I saw some very early flowering fly orchids, none of which are in these photographs because they weren't particularly good ones. These are nearly all taken in Gloucestershire. But what I really went to see were these. So this is the first of the hybrids that I saw this year, and absolutely stunning little beasts. Strange thing, of course, being that the woodcock orchid doesn't occur in Britain. So again, debates rage over whether these are naturally occurring and where the genes from the woodcock orchid came from. But absolutely beautiful little orchids, these. I think there's at least 2 sites that I know of where this particular hybrid grows. Whether there's more, I don't know. My next trip on the 10th of May was to go to Selsey Common. I don't know whether any of you know about these orchids on Selsey Common, but these are a very similar looking hybrid, and these are hybrid between fly orchid and bee orchid. I've been to see these for quite a few years now, and it is surprising the variety or variation in this hybrid. I'm fairly certain that hybridization has occurred between the 2 species more than once, and quite possibly there's been regression, and these are not all F1 hybrids. Some of them have either crossed with the original parents or with themselves, because as you can see, this one has got sepals like a bee orchid, whereas if we go back to the previous ones, these have got sepals more like a fly orchid. What was interesting was when you look at them like this, you can see there's quite a difference in shape in the lips. But again, you can compare the sepals now and see that these are quite different from this one. I did wonder at one time if this was just a case of these were more gone over than these, but over the years I've been back several times now, and these are the standard sepals on most of them, and this is probably the more unusual one. So what I did then was I put together the 2 lots of hybrids I'd been to see. these three on the right are the fly bee orchids. These two on the left are the woodcock fly orchids. And when I put this on the Native Orchids Facebook group, it generated a huge amount of discussion. I think there were far more comments following this particular photo or composite photograph than anything else I saw this year. And at least two people implied that these pictures showed that the hybrids in Dorset were actually fly bee ones, because they said they were so similar to these. I'm not sure I agree with them. However, you can see what they mean. This one in particular, the speculum here, looks quite like this one over here. But anyway, I leave it up to you to decide whether they are. I don't think they're the same species, and these flower much earlier, in line with the woodcock orchid, that it's one of its parents. Back into Gloucestershire, two places you can see sword-leaved helleborine. These are the ones on Rodborough Common. Now, the interesting thing about these is when I first came to Gloucestershire and started looking for orchids in the late 70s and early 80s, the supplement to the flora makes no mention of these sword-leaved helleborines on Rodborough Common. And there's just a little group of them in one little patch. And I'm vaguely suspicious that they've been planted by someone there, but they're there year after year now, so no real reason. Perhaps they are naturalized, perhaps they did get there naturally, I don't know. But to me, really, you've got to go here to see the sword-leaved helleborine. This is the cathedral of orchids, or the cathedral for sword-leaved helleborines anyway. And I'm sure that two pilgrimages here are worth one to Rome anyway, because getting down to this site here is incredibly difficult. Or at least I'm finding it more and more difficult as the years go on. The weird thing about this site is that I discovered it before I knew about orchids when I was in the Scouts. We had an evening boat or canoe ride up the Wye on the incoming tide, and we stopped at this location here, had a campfire and fried some sausages or whatever, waited for the tide to turn, and then canoed back down to Chepstow. And this really is a special little place, absolutely stunning, as well as the flowers. These grow everywhere in the woods in Gloucestershire. I only saw them in 3 places this year, but it'd be ever so easy. In fact, I've missed a couple of places out because I saw them in 2 places in the Forest of Dean as well this year. But lots of them. Interesting plant. Because of the number of orchids there are to see, I'm not pausing on each one and talking about their biology or anything. This is purely and simply a race around the country to see these different ones. Right, on it shows you how early things were this year. The year before, 2021, on the 19th of May, the flowers, the monkey orchids weren't out at Hartslock, and I was under the impression that the monkey orchids had completely failed at Hartslock. And yet here we were on the 13th of May, and I actually saw monkey orchids there. It's not necessarily the place you go to see monkey orchids, although it was the first place I ever went to see monkey orchids. Here they are. These photographs were actually taken at Park Gate Down in Kent, where the monkey orchid grows much bigger and stronger. I don't know whether you can see a monkey in these pictures here, quite possibly. And one of the well, the main reason for going to Hartslock is to see this hybrid between the lady orchid and the monkey orchid. Absolutely fantastic hybrid vigor. These are probably the biggest orchids that I see in Britain. Although, to be fair, I possibly haven't seen lizard orchids growing to their full height. Now then, this is a bit of a mixed page, and I'll explain why. These two over here are monkey orchids, and one of the ways of telling that something is a genuine monkey orchid is that the monkey orchid is the only British orchid that opens from the top downwards. All the others, the flowers open at the bottom and go upwards. And the story about Hartslock is that many years ago, someone introduced lady orchids into the woodland next to the grassland. And the plants are still there, but they just don't flower. Now, this year, this plant grew. These are the hybrids behind. And everybody, or a lot of people, say that this is a genuine lady orchid. I'm not expert enough to comment, and as you'll see when we look at some lady orchid pictures in a minute, it does look very similar. So it's quite possible that there has been the lady orchids or something in the soil has stayed there. But in previous years when I visited Hartslock, there hasn't been a lady orchid at the site for me to see. There's just been the hybrids, and some years there have been monkey orchids. So this is the hybrid swarm. There's the lone lady orchid there. Absolutely fantastic, these hybrids. Range of colors. You can see the monkey in them. I don't see so much lady in them, actually. If you haven't seen them, well worth going to see. And it's, if you take your time and don't rush just to see these, you can park in the village of Goring, walk down the Thames, where it's really good bird watching actually down there along the river, and then walk up onto Hartslock Nature Reserve. Whilst there, the reason that the white haileybury comes in at this point is number 8 that I saw, that there were some white haileyburies at Hartslock, but not as good as some of the ones that we get in Gloucestershire. And again, Gloucestershire is absolutely full of white haileyburies, so you should all have seen those. I think actually these two pictures were taken in Kent, but we get equally as good ones. So here we are, lady orchid, and again the reason that it occurs here is because I saw this one that possibly was a lady orchid at Hartslock, but I was on my way to Kent to actually see the lady orchids, and here they are. These are pictures taken at a place called Bonsai Bank. I met a chap there and was chatting to him, and I told him that I'd been taking some photographs lying on the ground photographing these lady orchids. I said up to my left there was a turtle dove purring, and up to my right there was a nightingale singing, and I said I thought I'd died and gone to heaven photographing the orchids and listening to two birds that are very difficult to get in touch with in Gloucestershire. He then, a few days later, when I put exactly the same thing as a post on the Native Orchids site, recognised what I'd said, and we had quite a long exchange of thoughts about Bonsai Bank. On the way to Kent in Buckinghamshire, there's a site where you can see military orchids. There's 2 sites, quite possibly there's more, but there's only 2 that people get to hear about where you can see them. And again, this is an absolutely fantastic orchid. I think possibly on this picture, you can perhaps get an idea. They're named after the redcoat soldiers. Here we've got the buttons coming down the coat. Again, it's a place that nowadays anybody can go and visit. There's no restrictions. They don't just have an open day during the flowering period. You can go in. A large number of them are roped off, but equally large numbers are easily approachable. Some of them have cages over, but you can lift the cages over for photographs. And there's loads of other orchids to see here as well. So at Homefield Wood. That was where I saw the first greater butterflies of the year, but they were only just coming into bud. These were on Edge Common. Edge Common's got a lovely colony of greater butterfly orchids. So here are a range of the greater butterfly. And while we were at Homefield, although it was quite early, or at least I thought it was early, there were tway blades in flower. As you can see, it's one of the orchids that you tend to see in lots and lots of different places. I think it was the orchid that I saw second most frequently. So there's the tway blade. And on that first day, on the 13th, going to Kent, a friend of mine had told me about a site just off the motorway. And it was getting late in the day, and our real reason, or at least my wife's real reason for going to Kent, was to see grandchildren. My real reason was to see the orchids. And it was getting quite late in the day after we'd made several stops on the way. But I wanted, because this was our side of Tunbridge Wells, or our side of Kent, I wanted to have a look at them. So my long-suffering wife got dragged up this quite steep bank, quite a long way, and we got to roughly where we'd been told the man orchids were, and we couldn't find them. Karen kept looking at her watch saying, the boys will be going to bed soon. Come on, we've got to get going. I want to see the boys before they go to bed. And just as I gave in and turned around, there were some of them. I really like man orchids. It took me many years to see my first one. And now I make an annual trip to see them. Kent has got to be the place really to see them. But if you don't want to travel to Kent, there's a place on Breeden Hill where you can see them. And there were good numbers growing there this year. So I don't know what it is about them. In some respects, they're quite a relatively boring looking orchid, but I really do like the man orchid. Perhaps it's the fact that it was on the cover of the Harrop book, so that makes me like them, I don't know. At this point, I still hadn't really decided whether or not to try and see all the orchids. And I saw on a post on the Native Orchids Facebook group that the lax-flowered orchids were flowering in Jersey. And so again, a complete spur of the moment thing. I booked a flight from Bristol to Jersey. Would you believe it was cheaper to fly one day, stay overnight and fly back the next day than to fly early in the morning and come back late in the evening? In fact, it would have cost almost twice as much to do it in a day. It's an easy thing to do in a day, though, if you're desperate to do it. The site where they grow is probably within walking distance of the airport. I hired a car, and it literally was 5 minutes from the airport down to the reserve where they grow. And if you read Leif Berthsweden's book, he talks about getting there and finding a gate saying orchid fields closed, not open until the 27th of May or something. And I found the gate that he went to. I then found another way into the reserve, and you don't actually have to go into the orchid fields because these are growing all over the reserve. The little area that they call the orchid fields has got most of them in, but there are hundreds and hundreds all over the reserve. And a bit like a giant early purple orchid, really, or a loosely flowered inflorescence like the early purple. They do have a bit of variation in them. So some of them are these lovely pink colors as well as the deep purples. Yeah. But the site also had several other species, so that's why Southern Marsh Orchid comes in at number 15. And these were some taken there. Absolutely typical marsh orchids, quite a thick hollow stem, big bracts sticking out, absolutely typical leaf markings on these. and it being Jersey, they were out well ahead of most other places. So nice to see these. We'll come to Heath Spotted in a moment, but there were a few Heath Spotted coming into flower in Jersey, and in amongst the Southern Marsh orchids were these hybrids between Heath Spotted and Southern Marsh. So you can see that the bracts are very similar to the marsh orchid, but unlike the marsh orchids, these leaves are spotted. It's got a bit of the leaf shape, more of the leaf shape of the Southern Marsh, but quite distinctive. When you see them in an area where there's lots and lots of pure line Southern Marsh and quite a few Heath Spotted, you can pick out these quite distinctly. The lip patterns are quite different as well. However, I should say at this point that identifying hybrids is fraught with difficulty, and context is everything. The fact that there were Southern Marsh and Heath Spotted present flowering at the same time was probably the major factor. Although, of course, the shape of the flower, once you start looking, but I think the next one, is a hybrid between common spotted and Heath Spotted. So the lip petal is not quite Heath Spotted and not quite common spotted. The markings are slightly different. And again, because they're growing alongside each other, it does help convince you that they are the genuine thing. People might disagree. And if you have different views on this, by all means, disagree. For me, one of the nicest places to see Heath Spotted orchid is Vicarage Meadows in mid Wales. Now, these are the absolutely typical flowers of the Heath Spotted. As you can see, instead of dots, it's more or less joined up lines in this loop here. Can be confused sometimes with the common spotted, but the common spotted has a lip petal with 3 roughly equal sized lobes, whereas the Heath Spotted always has a more blousy appearance because the 2 outside lobes of the lip petal are much bigger than the central one. This is a diddy little one on the Burren in Ireland. None of the Heath Spotteds growing there grew very big, and I was quite surprised to see Heath Spotted there, to be honest with you, because you're on a massive limestone, and these generally prefer a more acidic soil. And in Gloucestershire, the only place where they still grow, to my knowledge anyway, is Poor's Allotment, which of course is a more acidic soil compared to lots of the grasslands in Gloucestershire. Again, I spent the better part of the day at Vicarage Meadow, and I'll explain why in a moment, but in doing so and getting fed up of not finding what I was looking for, I ended up taking a photograph of virtually every different shade Heath Spotted orchid that I could find, right from these very deep purpley ones down to totally anthocyanin free white versions of it. I suppose I should explain at that point, I'd hoped to find small white orchid at Vicarage Meadow. It used to occur there. No one's seen it for about 2 or 3 years. And I literally spent 4 hours there and didn't manage to find any. But it didn't matter because I was going on a trip later anyway that I'd already booked. Right. Oh, and the reason that I've got lizard orchid here is because I saw one in bud on Jersey. I didn't actually see them in flower until the end of May. So they were part of a big trip back to Kent. These are absolutely amazing orchids. They're so exotic and weird looking. We have one or two occasionally in Gloucestershire. If you go down to Breen, there's reasonable numbers of them. If you go to Sandwich Bay, however, you're just overwhelmed by them. There are thousands of them, and they're absolutely amazing to see. Bit of a funny story about that trip to Kent. It was overnight. I stayed in a hotel, and I knew I was going to Sandwich Bay in the morning, and I had a quick look through my bird twitching app and saw that there was a red-footed falcon at Sandwich Bay. So I thought, oh, I'll go and have a look at that on my way to see the lizard orchids. So I just let the sat nav take me to the place. I thought, oh, this is good. There's only one other car here, so it won't be too bad. I walked along the bank, and as I approached, I could see a crowd of about 100 odd people looking for this red-footed falcon. So I turned around and went back and went to see the lizard orchids, which I had all to myself. I must be the only twitcher in Britain that didn't see the red-footed falcon at that point. So, however, I'd seen them in Rhodes earlier in the year, so I didn't mind. This was a fantastic trip. Also cheap booze. I couldn't believe how cheap the gin was on the ferry to and from Ireland. So I'm currently making an awful lot of slow gin and damson gin as a result of all the bottles of gin that I could buy on the boat. In fact, we couldn't carry our full allowance. So we went to Ireland because of this orchid here, and one that I'll show you in a minute. This is the Irish marsh orchid. It only grows in Ireland. To me, it looks very similar to a northern marsh orchid. Lovely rich colours, and where you find it, it grows in good numbers. Just about any boggy corner of a field, you'll find them growing. And this was the other real reason, the dense flowered orchid. I'd not seen these before. I'd not seen the Irish marsh orchids before. And I was desperate to see these. And there's a sort of moral to this story in that I'd been given some grid references to go and check out for the dense flowered orchid. And I'd assumed that when I got to the west coast of Ireland, to the Burren, that there would be a shop and that they'd have a local ordnance survey map. Well, the first difficulty over on the west coast was finding a shop. And then having found, I should point out at this point that my wife was grumbling all the time we were there. There are no Marks and Spencers and no cafes. Luckily, there were a few bars. And I couldn't find a map. And I asked in one shop where was the nearest place I'd be able to get a map, and the answer came back, probably Dublin. No one uses maps anymore, sir. Everybody uses these modern apps. That was a poor Irish accent. Sorry, I wasn't even trying an accent. So I had to sort of roughly remember directions that people had said. And luckily, we got to see them, and we found some. Because the area of the Burren that we were in was almost at sea level, a lot of them were almost over. But we did find some at a slightly higher elevation, and here they were flowering. The chap that I mentioned earlier on, who saw 105 species in 2019, he was there a day or two after me, and all the places that he visited, the dense flowered orchids were over, and he ended up having to go up into Northern Ireland and get some altitude to see them. Another new one for me was the Pugsley's marsh orchid. Some of you might know this as the narrow-leaved marsh orchid. Quite an impressive little flower. Much fewer flowers than most of the other marsh orchids, and quite often the flowers are all opening in one direction on just one side. Quite a pretty flower. Here it is close up. One of the things that is noticeable about Pugsley's, because it is quite confusable with some of the others, but it has a genuine leaf quite high up on the flower stem. And I found quite a few where this leaf actually extended above the inflorescence. And there's no other marsh orchid that does that. Most of the leaves that grow near the inflorescence on marsh orchids are bracts like these, but Pugsley's has a genuine leaf which is coming up and occasionally over the inflorescence, so quite a helpful identification characteristic. And while we were there in one of the fields, I saw several lesser butterfly orchids. As you can see on here, you can see them in Gloucestershire. There's some doubt about the sheepscombe common ones, whether they are genuine lessers or even genuine greaters. And a lot of people think they're hybrids between the two, all the ones at Sheepscombe. Bull's Cross has some really good lessers. And then in Scotland, we visited a site that was full, absolutely full of lesser butterfly orchids. In fact, this one was from, and they tend to be a species that grows more on neutral or acidic soils compared to the limestones of Gloucestershire. So it didn't come as a surprise that these are more of a northern species. And for those of you that are wondering how you tell the difference between a lesser and a greater butterfly orchid, the lesser has parallel pollinia, as we've seen here. And in the greater, they're at an angle, meeting almost at the top and wide apart at the bottom. And again, early marsh orchid is here at number 22 because I saw the Irish version of it in the Burren. And again, there's another sad tale to tell here that I found. I think they call it the flecked orchid in Ireland. And it's a beautifully, slightly different coloured version of the early marsh orchid from this. And I found a couple and thought, well, they're not particularly great specimens. I'll just take a couple of shots on my phone and I'll wait until I see some others to bother to get all the photographic gear out. And then I didn't see any more. And when I looked at my phone photos, the light hadn't been good enough and they were rubbish photos. So I haven't actually got any of the Irish version of the early marsh orchid. These show quite nicely why it's called incarnata. It's the flesh-coloured orchid. This is the absolutely typical form of the early marsh orchid. And then in a lot of the Welsh dunes, you get these beautiful dark red versions of the early marsh orchid. And this year, while I was at Kenfig, I found this white one as well, which for me was quite an unusual find for an early marsh orchid. And I only know one site in Gloucestershire where I can see early marsh orchids, and that's at Bourton on the Water, the GWT reserve up there. Right, where are we? Visit 14, and we're on to species 23. Oh, right, yes, Sunday the 29th of May, okay. Fairly typical orchid, I'm sure most of you know it. Best time to go and see these, though, on the commons, whether it's Selsey, Rodborough, Minchinhampton, is go in the evening on a still day. Because the scent from them in the evening is unbelievable. And the great thing about these is that any hybrids that have got a fragrant orchid as their parent produce that beautiful scent. And it's one of the ways of telling if a hybrid is a hybrid of a fragrant orchid or not, because most of the other hybrids don't produce a scent, but anything that hybridizes with a fragrant has a lovely scent from it. So here they are. Distinctive, huge, long spurs on them. The thing to look for is there's 3 species. We'll see all 3 in a minute of fragrant orchid. The chalk fragrant has this sort of shaped flower with slightly downward pointing lateral petals. We'll have a look at the others in a moment when we get to them. So living up to its name, this was the orchid I encountered most frequently. These are most of the sites that I've seen it at. But I chose to use this picture because it's quite an unusual common spotted orchid, as I think it was probably this one. This one is it close up. These are in the dunes on Anglesey. You don't usually see them with these bracts sticking out quite like this. It gave them quite a nice sort of hairy appearance, which I quite liked. Again, you get them ranging from very deep purpley coloured, and there's a fantastic little clump of these on Minchin Hampton Common, which every year they're there, and they're absolutely no anthocyanin in them at all. Totally white flowers, no spots on the leaves, totally green parts and totally white parts, with just the pollinia having this little bit of colour here. There's a version of the common spotted that looks vaguely like this, but with the whole of the end of the lip petal purple, which I'd like to see, but I'll have to wait for another year. Here is an example of a hybrid with a fragrant. This is common spotted. Incredible vigor. All the other fragrant orchids and common spotted orchids around it were half the height. Absolute monster, full of flowers, fantastic scent. And as you can see, it's sort of midway between a common spotted and a chalk fragrant in terms of the shape and length of its spur. Again, when you see it in context, it really does stand out as a hybrid. This was a very strange hybrid and is part of the reason why frog orchids got moved into the Dactylorhiza group. They used to be in a genus of their own, but it was the fact that they hybridized with other Dactylorhizas that got the frog orchid changed into the Dactylorhiza group. Rather annoyingly, I turned up at this reserve, Morgan's Hill in Wiltshire, just as these few plants were coming to their end, and I assumed that was it. Went away happy that I'd seen these. About 10 days later, people were reporting new ones flowering there that were in perfect condition, but I wasn't able to get back to see them. So. Now this trip, which was visit number 15 of the year, was a pre-arranged trip with the Hardy Orchid Society to go to Kent and make sure that I got to see late spider orchid, because I'd tried to see late spider orchid over several years previously, and I'd either mistimed it or just couldn't find them. So I was booked on to a field meeting with the Hardy Orchid Society, and about 2 weeks before it, got an email saying they're flowering early this year. It may be that the field meeting is going to be a bit late. I'll keep you informed. When I saw another email from the chap leading the meeting, I thought, oh gosh, he's going to say that the 30th is, or 31st is going to be too late. Anyway, what he actually was writing to say was that the place that we were going to see them, all the late spider orchids had been dug up. Again, you might have read about this in the papers. Every single plant at the site that he had planned to take us to had been dug up. And it must be someone who knows quite a bit about them, because they weren't at a site that is normally visited by people, and he hadn't let on to where we were going. He'd arranged the meeting place, and then we were all going to be taken from there to this secret site. Anyway, the chap leading the meeting was absolutely distraught, cancelled, said, I can't lead a meeting or whatever. However, when I wrote to him, he did say, well, because I was booked into a hotel, I said, I'm coming anyway. can you suggest anywhere I might go to see some late spider orchids? And he gave me directions to a place on Y Nature Reserve that I'd visited 3 times previously, almost, well, to the exact spot that he described. So I wasn't too hopeful, but as you'll see when we get to it, I did get to see late spider orchids. On the way, I called in at Clattinga Farm to make sure I saw these. There is a site in Gloucestershire, but as far as I'm aware, they didn't flower this year because of the dry weather at Hornsley Sow Rough. These are the burnt tip orchid. Also, while I was at Clattinga, got my first bee orchids of the year. For those of you that go to the water park regularly, the roundabout at the end of the Spine Road is probably one of the best orchid sites there is, especially for bee orchid and wasp orchid. The roundabout is absolutely full of them, and it has pyramidals as well. I put this in to show the variation in the lip forms of the bee orchid. And of course, the sort of major variant of the bee orchid, Vartrolii, is the wasp orchid. This flowers pretty well in Clattinga Farm Reserve and on the roundabout on the Spine Road. So, in fact, the ones on the Spine Road are sturdier and are better specimens. But of course, you're surrounded by traffic all the time while you're looking at them there. A couple of other slightly odder variants. This one has flowered on Minchinhampton for a few years now, near Tom Long's Post. And this is called the bicolour bee orchid, for pretty obvious reasons. And then on the edge of the common, there is a little colony of these lovely sepaloid bee orchids. As you can see, these 2 petals, instead of being the normal sort of antennae of the bee, are growing rather like petals. I think they should be called petaloid, but there we are. The name that they've got is sepaloid bee orchids. Rather pretty, much more pink on them. Here's, just because they're fantastic and I absolutely love bee orchids, here's a selection of them again with wasp orchid in the middle. Now, one of these, yeah, it's this one. It's not very often that I've seen wasp and bee growing so close to each other that I was able to get them in the same photograph. So that's why that one's there. And of course, there were pyramidals on this roundabout. As you can see, flowering on the 30th of May. Well, I usually associate, or I used to associate, pyramidal orchids with the end of June, beginning of July. So it shows how early this year was. Pretty widespread orchid, and probably my least favourite. I don't know why. I just find them slightly vulgar and candy floss type things. However, what was nice was finding some, normally they don't vary that much either. They're normally more this sort of colour. This one was in the woods behind the dunes on Anglesey in Newborough Forest. And this one, I've seen it a few years now, this plant. It's near Tom Long's Post on Minchinhampton. Not sure why this page is here, just a mixture of things that were seen on that trip to Kent. Still in Clattinga Farm, actually, early marsh orchid and common spotted hybrid. There were lots and lots of them this year. And if you go to Clattinga, the difficulty is actually finding pure line plants. Most of the orchids growing there seem to be hybrids of either the early marsh and common spotted or southern marsh and common spotted. These were photographed next to the sailing lake, actually. Is it Lake 10? I've forgotten what it is in the water park. So the most vigorous hybrids you'll ever see, and you can see why they're called grandis. They are truly grand orchids, the hybrid between common spotted and southern marsh. Here's why I went to Kent, though, at the end of May. And these were a first for me. Like I say, I've searched for them over several years and not found them. And what was really irritating was they were exactly where he said they were, and they were in exactly the spot that I have searched 3 times previously and not found them. Timing is obviously everything, but here they are, amazing orchids, member of the bee family, the Ophrys. Grow like mad in the Mediterranean. On the Greek islands, there's loads of them, but we're obviously right at the northern end. And as Ken and I were talking about at the start, before I got going on this, their pollinator doesn't occur in this country. So in order to try and perpetuate them, most of these tend to get hand pollinated. And as you can see in this one here, this one hasn't been pollinated yet, or this one. But look at the variation in them. Aren't they stunning? In fact, this one, it made me wonder if there was woodcock orchid in this one's genes. This is a very similar patterning, particularly to the eastern woodcock orchid that you find at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. But it is a variation that or pattern that you see on several of them. But well worth the wait, I think, and well worth the journey to go and see them. As part of that trip, I went up into Essex to see these tongue orchids. They're on the site of an old market garden, so they might well have been introduced, but it hasn't been a market garden for very many years, and it's they're now a natural colony or a naturalized colony, self-perpetuating. Some of you may have signed a petition to try and prevent the field being built on. It certainly made a lot of the petition websites and so on. Now, going back to something I said earlier, I wish that I realise now that had I planned my trip to Kent a little more carefully, I could probably, if I just go back to wherever it was, where's it gone? Where's it gone? Come on. There. Sorry, where's it? It's right at the start. As you can see, there were a huge number of species seen. And if you count these up, in that one day, I saw 18 species. Now, if I had realized I was getting close, I'd probably have made a bit more effort to go and see the remaining early spider orchids and a couple of other things in Kent on that Monday, and possibly got to 25 species in a day, which would have been pretty amazing, seeing half the British species in one day. So, but I hadn't thought about it like that before I went. Like I say, I'd been concentrating on seeing the late spider orchids. That had been the main aim. I ended up seeing them in 2 places, in fact, both at Wye National Nature Reserve and on the Folkestone Downs above the railway terminus. So that was quite nice, finally catching up with them. These are quite amazing things. And plants have cropped up in several years in Britain, both in Cornwall and in Eastern England. Sad thing about the another species of tongue orchid this year, and it got destroyed before I could go and see it. But on a motorway verge in Kent, the ploughshare tongue orchid flowered this year. And the suspicion is that the highways people got fed up of people climbing over the fence onto the motorway embankment to take pictures of them. So they put herbicide on them to destroy them, which was a bit of a shame. But there we are. Frog orchid is a plant that you can see quite well in Gloucestershire, Swift's Hill, Cleve Hill. And in fact, you get early ones at Swift's Hill and you get late ones on Cleve Hill. So you can see them over quite a long period of time. However, all the Gloucestershire ones are quite small plants, seldom growing more than perhaps 6 inches tall. And yet this picture you can see here is of an absolutely huge frog orchid. These are more what you see in Gloucestershire. And the interesting thing is, I think you can tell that these are from Swift's Hill because they're much greener than the ones you get on Cleve Hill, which tend to be much redder in the flower than these. That big one that was on the previous page, that one and that one, these were taken in Cumbria on our way up to Scotland on a trip that I'll come to in a minute. I couldn't believe it when we stopped in this little lane and had a look at this roadside verge, and seeing frog orchids this size was absolutely unbelievable. Never seen anything like them in Gloucestershire. Ken was asking, did I see slipper orchids? The answer is yes. The last few years, 2020 accepted, so probably 5-6 years or now on the trot, I've been going up to Gate Barrows and the Ingleborough area and across to a couple of other places in North Yorkshire. These were photographed at a place called Kilnsey Fish Farm. It's one of the reintroduction sites. So these are reintroduced ones. They're not remaining wild. Well, they are growing wild now, but they are reintroduced. And on this particular trip, our 18th trip, I stayed at Ingleton because the Ingleton Waterfalls Walk was one of the reintroduction sites, but they appear to have gone from there. So having spent the morning going to have a look in Ingleton, we then drove over to Malham. You can see them outside the field centre at Malham Tarn, but they're in a very tight-fitting cage, not at all suitable for photography. So having seen that they were in flower, we drove on over to Kilnsey, which is in Wharfdale, so it's a bit of a drive. When we got there, I went to pay for us to go into the trout farm and jokingly said, I am in time for the lady slipper orchids, aren't I? And the bloke looked at me and said, oh, you might not be, he said. People have been saying they've gone over. I haven't been up there myself. Anyway, I paid my entrance fee. It costs £5 to go into the fish farm. Walked up the path and onto the hillside where they were growing. And the first cage we came to was empty. There were just burnt, withered plants in it. Second cage we came to, burnt, withered. I thought, oh, blimey. At that point, I was about to go home. But my wife said, well, let's walk on up because it's quite a nice walk up to a stream further up the hillside. And fortunately, the last cage of all still had a few lady slipper orchids in it in absolutely perfect condition. So these are they. Really exotic looking things, aren't they? What on earth are they doing growing in Britain? Although saying that, in the Victorian era, there were millions of them. And rather like the dodo and the passenger pigeon, they got driven to extinction by collectors. At Malham, well, we're at Malham Tarn, saw the first northern marsh orchids of the year. As you can see, very similar to the Irish marsh orchid, but apparently genetically distinct. I'm sure if you saw them growing next to each other, you'd have trouble telling them apart. However, the northern Martha orchid produces some absolutely stunning hybrids. I mean, you could imagine that these were grown for gardens, couldn't you? Absolutely beautiful things. Trip number 19 down to the dunes at Kenfig. And as you can see from the list, Kenfig Dunes is an absolutely brilliant place to go and look at orchids. If you time it right, probably about a week later, it would have been better because The marsh helleborines were just starting to appear but not flowering. These would still have been going a week or two later. So you would see an awful lot of orchids there. And some years the dunes are just covered in them. This year there weren't a lot of orchids around. Still a good number of species, but you had to look for them. Whereas most years, once you start walking through the slacks, there are just hundreds and hundreds of orchids. I chose a bad year in many respects to try and see them because it was so dry and early. Quite a weird orchid, the fen orchid. The flower is upside down and depends on raindrops falling onto it to expel the pollinia. Probably didn't do very well this year setting seed in that case. So visit 23 was in fact the one up to Vicarage Meadows. In Leaf's book, he did Vicarage Meadows and Kenfig Dunes in a day. Well, in actual fact, I spent so much time at both of them that they need 2 separate days. And the beauty of Vicarage Meadows is that it's a site for heath fragrant orchids. And here is the heath fragrant. You probably can't remember, but the shape of the lip petal in the chalk fragrant was about as wide as it is long. Heath fragrant, it's longer than it is wide, and the wing petals are more horizontal. Love these. Really nice, lovely scent from them. Even in midday with the sun shining on them, there was still a bit of scent. But the fragrant orchids are moth pollinated, so they tend to produce their scent in the evenings. Now I've put this here, but in actual fact it was seen. I saw this on the way up to Scotland, and this is a very rare hybrid between heath fragrant and Pugsley's marsh orchid, and a group of 6 of us searched for a good hour or so before we found just a couple of them at one of the 2 sites where they're known to occur. But this huge spur is highly characteristic of the hybrid. At the same site, there were hybrid heath spotted and northern marsh orchid. Here we are back in Gloucestershire again, visit 24. I tell people that this is the orchid of Gloucestershire. There are probably more musk orchids in Gloucestershire than anywhere else. And in a good year, you can see thousands and thousands of them on Cleve, Painswick Beacon, various other places. Strange little orchid, pollinated by ants, I believe. This was the reason for going to Scotland. So trip 25, this and a couple of others we'll come to in a minute. This was a new species for me, small white orchid. When we'd been at Ingleton, the day that I was telling you about, that we first of all went round the waterfalls looking for the slipper orchid, then over to Malham Tarn, then over to Wharfdale. We came back to Ribble Head Viaduct and visited a little quarry reserve near the viaduct. And then I managed to persuade my wife, which was rather stupid of me, to go to another reserve, by which time she was absolutely fed up with wandering around nature reserves. And I'd persuaded her to go to the wrong reserve, because I'd persuaded her to go to one just down Ribblesdale. Small white orchid actually grows there. But by the time I said, oh, just one more reserve to visit today before it gets dark, no, she said, we're going to the pub. And I got dragged screaming and kicking to a Robinson's pub where there was some rather nice beer. So made up for it. And I knew I was going to see this in Scotland anyway. I was quite surprised at how similar it looked to the dense flowered orchid, actually. Here it is close up. Perhaps not as big a lip as the dense flowered orchid. and growing amongst it, probably the rarest orchid in Britain, the hybrid small white orchid crossed with the heath fragrant orchid. I think it only grows at this one site, a place called Flower Fields in the Boat of Garten, and I think there were 2 plants there this year. And as you can see, we were perhaps fractionally too early, just a few flowers open. I don't know whether this is a pollinator or not. What I was really chuffed about going to Scotland, though, was to see coral root orchid. They can be incredibly difficult to find at the English sites. And once you know the sites near Carbridge, they're not hugely difficult to find. They're growing in quite dark conditions under Scots pine in marshy areas, but quite an amazing looking little orchid. There they are close up. And growing with them was the other one that I, earlier in the season, I'd gone to the Black Mountains to try and find this orchid. This is the lesser twayblade orchid. It's only a few inches tall, but what lovely detail there is in these tiny flowers. Absolutely stunning little orchids. We also found these on the mountainside at Aviemore. What's the name of the mountain with the forgotten it. I'll remember it. Anyway, on our way back from Scotland, shows what an early year it was, 22nd of June, and the dark red helleborines in Cumbria were well out. And if I'd gone to see them a couple of weeks later, which I'd planned to do, I'd probably have missed them. This was at a quarry site just off the motorway. My favourite place to see them is a place called Hutton Roof, which is on the other side of the motorway. But you can also see them at Gate Barrows, and most people go to the classic site in County Durham, a quarry there where there are thousands of them. But these are growing on proper lime. Well, these are not necessarily on terribly good limestone pavement, but Hutton Roof and Gate Barrows are growing in beautiful limestone pavement, and that's the best place to see them. Stunning orchid. I then had to book on to another Hardy Orchid Society trip to see my 40th species, trip 27 of the year over to the Chilterns, because unfortunately the red helleborine that had flowered in Gloucestershire last year didn't flower this year and was obviously not going to flower, so I had to go over to the Chilterns to see it. Before the field meeting to go and see it, though, I went to this place called Aston Clinton Ragpits, and that was where that fairly fantastic chalk fragrant crossed with the common spotted was growing. We've got a Gloucestershire Naturalist coming out soon, which is dedicated to the red helleborine. David Armstrong has written a history of its flowering and recording in Gloucestershire, and I think this picture is going to appear in it, which is quite nice. I'm quite pleased that he thought it was a nice enough picture to include in his book. And this is possibly one of the pollinators of the red helleborine. This is the marmalade of a fly. Its scientific name is far too difficult for me to say. There are 2 sites in Gloucestershire where you can see marsh helleborines, and one just up the road in Herefordshire. But to be honest with you, the best places to see marsh helleborines are in sand dunes, which is where most of these. Oh no, that one there on the right was taken in Hoff Wood, the site in Herefordshire. But these are all dunes. Really fantastic orchid. I'd probably say this about every one, actually. Probably fed up of me saying it. Again, there's only one site in Gloucestershire where this orchid grows, the marsh fragrant, but it also grows in the same site in Hoffwood in Herefordshire that the marsh helleborines grow. And if we have a closer look at the flower, in this one you can see that the flower is broader than it is long, and the wing petals are angled down rather than horizontal like in the other two. There is a site in Cumbria where all three grow, and you have to be quite careful to look at them carefully to decide which one you're looking at. There's now a site in the Midlands where dune helleborine grows, sorry. But I wanted to see them in Newborough Forest. And in previous years, for example, when I was working and could only get to Anglesey in the school holidays, I was always too late for the dune helleborines. But this year, I got there at a good time to see them. I'm assured by a person that I met there that this year wasn't as good as last year. And I think that was the case for most orchids this year, that they just weren't as good this year as they have been in previous years. But this is the dune helleborine. And there are probably 4 or 5 types of dune helleborine. And I didn't go and see a couple of the types. I didn't go and see the Lindisfarne dune helleborine, and I didn't go and see the Tyne dune helleborine. But I think I will next year, because I discovered after we came back from Anglesey that Newborough Warren, in fact, has 2 different types of dune helleborine, one growing in Newborough Forest on the sandy soils behind the dunes, and then out on Newborough Warren itself, there are different, or they say they're different. Again, if you look at pictures, it's almost impossible to tell. I included this picture here because this is definitely a dune helleborine. And as you can see, its pollinia are breaking up to self-pollinate. But what is quite unusual, but it is mentioned that it does occur in the books, is it's got this little sticky patch here, which would normally be for insect pollination. So I suppose there is an outside chance that occasionally dune helleborines get insect pollinated. And certainly at Cuttlepool Lane in the Midlands, the dune helleborines are hybridizing with the broad-leaved helleborines, and that's possibly due to the fact that there could be some insect pollination happening. On the way home from Anglesey, called in at the only mainland site for Irish ladies' tresses, which is in Wales at Borth Bog. I'd have had to go back to Ireland or up to some of the Scottish islands to see it if it hadn't been growing in Wales. And again, when the 2 books that were the inspiration for doing this, seeing them all, they had to go to Ireland or to Scotland to see it. So fortunately for me, it's only 2.5 hours or so from home to go and see it. And anyway, I called in on the way home from Anglesey to see Irish ladies' tresses, an American species basically, hence its West Coast distribution. The assumption is it's got here quite naturally. Back in Gloucestershire then for narrow-lipped helleborine. Several sites on the Cotswolds for narrow-lipped helleborine. Probably the worst ever year for narrow-lipped helleborine. And unfortunately, just as the flowers were opening, we hit that short spell of really intense hot weather, and the flowers all burnt. I was lucky to get this just before they burnt. And then I was lucky to be told of a site in the Wye Valley that had recently been discovered for narrow-lipped helleborine, and they were still in flower when I went to see them. As you can see, not great, but these are probably the orchid that suffered the most from the dry weather, because they were flowering just at that peak of the hot weather. So I've cheated here. This is a flower from a previous year for you to see the distinctive shape of the lower lip of the narrow-lipped helleborine. Another one that suffered this year was the green-flowered helleborine, which flowers at edge common, or they don't call, the National Trust don't call it edge common. They call it something hill, I've forgotten. But anyway, there were still quite a few there. And this is as much as the flowers in most years ever open. It's a self-pollinating one. As you can see, the ovaries are starting to swell and the flowers have never opened on this one. Some years they do open. Again, I've cheated for you to see. And they're the most indistinct flowers of all. All the petals and all the sepals basically look the same when it does open. Slightly confusable with the narrow-lipped helleborine. And just across the road from Edge Common in Maitland Wood, some years there are lots and lots of green-flowered helleborines. They tend to grow up out of the ivy. And because I had observed this, I went to a site in Kent a few years ago where everybody raves about the green-flowered helleborines growing in the roadside verge at a lay-by. And there were good numbers of them in the lay-by, and yes, they all look like, in fact, this might even be a picture from there. I can't remember. No, it's not, because I didn't go there this year, and all of these except that one were taken this year. But anyway, I decided to explore the woodland behind this roadside verge, and I'd never seen any reports of people finding them in the woodland. But in the woodland behind, again, there were hundreds of them just growing up through the ivy. The woodland floor was covered in ivy, like it is in places in Maitland Wood, and there were the green-flowered helleborines growing up out of it. So I suspect the ones in the roadside verge were just ones that had spread out of the woodland onto the verge, and that the main colony were actually inside the woodland. Perhaps not the most spectacular of helleborines, but I quite like them. So here's a couple more. I thought this one was going to survive the heat and produce a really good inflorescence. But I went back 2 or 3 times after finding it like this, and it never progressed beyond this. This was one right out in the open on Edge Common. Quite strange. Most of them grow under the trees. This one was out in the open near the quarries at the top of Edge Common. On to broad-leaved helleborine, species 47. So you can all see the finishing post. I like broad-leaved helleborines, and most years you get 2 or 3 weeks of flowering period to spend plenty of time photographing wasps, pollinating them. This year, presumably because of the heat and the activity of the wasps, the flowering period was much shorter and they went over very quickly. You can see this one has probably had its pollinia moved by a wasp, and instead of staying stuck to the wasp, they've stuck to one of the petals. Some years on Leckhampton Hill, this achlorophyllus broad-leaved helleborine grows. It tried growing again this year. I went back 2 or 3 times and it never got beyond this stage again. From what people tell me, quite a few years ago, it started off as quite a big, healthy specimen, but I'm guessing it has just never managed to get enough nutrition to keep itself in good condition. So this was only about 8-9 inches tall, and it never really got its flowers open this year. But it does look a bit strange, an all white broad-leaved helleborine growing up out of the ivy on Leckhampton Hill. This picture here, top middle, I found a plant that had been broken either by something nibbling at it or someone treading on it, or whatever. So I brought it home and I cut it in longitudinal section so that I could see into the cup. And it's in this cup of the epikyle of the lip petal. that there is a nice cocktail of liquids that the wasps like to feed on. They get very drunk on it. I just felt as I had a flower that had been damaged, I thought I'm going to cut it open and have a look. I think this was my last big trip of the year, a bit of craziness really, trip number 36. I was reaching the point where I had to decide what to do. Was I going to fly back to Scotland, fly to Inverness, hire a car and drive back into the Aviemore region to see these? Or was I going to drive over to Norfolk, where I knew there was a site and I knew they were flowering? And then the person who had told Leaf Birth Sweden where to go and see Creeping Ladies tresses, who I'd met on my trip to Scotland, rang me up and said, I've just heard that the Creeping Ladies tresses are flowering at Cliburn Moss in Cumbria. And I said, oh, that's a hell of a drive, Jeff. I think that's probably as bad as driving to Norfolk. I've got a feeling I'm going to fly to Scotland. And he said, well, I've also just heard that there's a site in Cumbria, 20 minutes drive from Cliburn Moss, where there are bog orchids. He said, I've never been there, but I've been given directions. And so I thought to myself, well, that's going to save me a trip to the New Forest. So I started off early. I picked my friend Jeff up at junction 19 on the M6. We drove on up all the way to Cliburn Moss, which is North Cumbria. It was a 4-hour or so drive, then a bit of a walk around Cliburn Moss, but then we saw these. I mean, aren't these absolutely fantastic? Again, this was another first for me, these Creeping Ladies tresses. We spent a couple of hours just because it was a bit of a damp day, and as the name Moss indicates, it's a marshy area. So we'd put full waterproofs on and we just lay there in this bog photographing and admiring these plants. Fortunately, there weren't very many. So once you'd checked that the area was clear of any plants, you could lie down in the bog with your waterproofs on and pretend you were some sort of seal or whatever taking the photographs. They were absolutely beautiful plants, aren't they? And then the cream on the pudding that day was 20 minutes away, the only site in Cumbria. We went and had a good search, and there were bog orchids. Not many. I think there were about half a dozen or so. I always think they look like angels, these angel wings sticking up here. And the beauty of this site in Cumbria was that we didn't do any damage to the bog habitat that they were in. There's a lot of fuss made about damage to the bog habitat in the New Forest because you actually have to get into the bog and get yourself wet to see bog orchids in the New Forest, whereas these were growing in damp areas alongside this stream. So you could actually lie on a fairly dry area, not in the bog, not damaging any of the bog habitat, to get photographs of these bog orchids. It's a place called Carrick Fell. And despite the fact that it was a school day, not a particularly nice day, and it was right out on the edge of the Lake District, you wouldn't believe the number of cars, cyclists and walkers that came through this area, all of them looking at two late middle-aged gentlemen lying in a bog taking photographs of orchids. Probably thought we were mad. But there we are. Fantastic little orchids, only about 2 inches tall. Ever so easy to miss them. It took me several goes of going to the New Forest before my daughter, who's much sharper-eyed than me, managed to point my first one out to me. And then back in Gloucestershire for the end of the orchid season. Despite the dry weather, the violet helleborines seem to do quite well this year. This is Lower Woods. There were several plants in lower woods this year, maybe not quite as many as last year. And Haleswood had plenty. I didn't go to any of the other sites where they are. I just went to lower woods and Haleswood. One of the great things this year, though, in lower woods was this one called the Rosier version of the violet helleborine. No chlorophyll in it at all. And it's just this purple and cream color. I think there may be, yeah, another picture of it here. But as far as I know, I went back twice, or did I go 3 times, to see if it ever straightened up and fully opened. And I haven't seen anybody sharing any pictures of it ever completely straightening up. It probably, the ground around it was quite dry, so it probably needed a bit more moisture. But characteristic, lovely flowers of the violet helleborine. And then the last species of the year, and the only one that I didn't drive to. I cycled to see this because Clifford's Mean churchyard has a small population of these orchids growing in it. These are not particularly good specimens. They were a bit dry and a bit unhappy, but they were the 51st species, so I was pretty happy. The ones in Plum Hill Quarry this year didn't do very well at all. There were over 50 last year. I could only find 6 this year, but then the year before I'd only found 5 or 6 as well. So I suspect that, although I think they're on their way out because there's no longer any grazing in Plum Hill, they're still hanging on. And the sites in the Leaden Valley that I go to see this were so dry that the grass was virtually gone. What grass was there was brown. There was just dry soil, and not a single autumn ladies tresses grew there. Whereas in 2019, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. But such are the fortunes of the weather and the luck of the orchids. Right, so that's it, everybody. I think we managed to get through it at a reasonable pace. So if any of you are still awake, I will stop sharing. Oh gosh, look, there are still people with their cameras on. Quite a lot with their cameras off. They've all gone for a cup of tea.
No, thank you. I thought that was wonderful. I'm a great orchid fan too.
Yeah, it's always a bit worrying when you get an enthusiast just enthusing about every single one being, oh, what a fantastic thing this is.
No, I think you're right.
The trouble is I'm a bit like it with birds as well. People come to see me bird ringing and they say, what's your favorite bird? I say, well, look at this one in my hand right now. Isn't this fantastic? And then the next one comes out of the bag. Look at this. It's impossible to have favorites, I think. But the orchids as a whole are genuinely a favorite of mine. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it wasn't too much of an enthusiast's ramble for you.
Oh, it's been lovely. Thank you.
I think one of the attractive things about orchids is that they're so often so damn difficult. Once you've got out the top 4 or 5, which are pretty common, the rest are often so damn difficult that you feel so chuffed to find the blooming things.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and like I was saying with the late spider orchids, I'd actually been to that site where I finally saw them 2 weeks previously and walked across where they were, thinking, well, they ought to be out now. Where are they? Why aren't they here? I know this is a place where they're meant to be. Went back 2 weeks later, and there they were. It is just, and I've been there several times in previous years as well. So yeah, I was really pleased to see them all. I might argue that the Lindisfarne dune orchid is a separate subspecies. But again, looking at pictures, if they were growing next to a dune orchid from Cuttlepool Lane or from Anglesey, I don't think you'd be able to tell the difference between them. So,
I think it's interesting to see how some of the names and the classifications have been altered over the years as they've got DNA to
Yes.
prove these things. That things change from what they were years ago.
Yeah. Well, that's why I didn't have to go to the Hebrides, for example, because the Hebridean orchid has been shown by genetic testing to just be Fuchsii, the common spotted, but a macaire version of it. Whereas when Leaf did his 52 species in a year, that Hebridean orchid was counted as one of his species. Whereas now the classification says it is just common spotted. But it remains as a variety and a good excuse to go to the Hebrides to get it on my list eventually. So, a bit like the northeastern ones. I'll go up to the northeast to see those next year.
I find the amount of hybridization in some of these Dactylorhiza and Marsh just unbelievable. It really made me think, what do we mean by a species? I'm not a biologist at all. My background's in physics, and you thought that if this plant is a daffodil, then it's a blooming daffodil, but that is not true. I look at some of the helleborines and you just wonder what on earth it is you have.
Yeah, and obviously the more DNA studies they do, they can show how more recently evolved some of these things are, and some of them only split into different species relatively recently. And of course, those that have split into species more recently are more likely to hybridize because they've still got more in common with the others. I'm a bit out of touch because I mean, I've been retired for several years now, but certainly when I was teaching A-level biology, it was one of the discussions that we would have: what is a species, and how do you define a species? And there are some biologists who will say that the species level of classification is even more artificial than the rest of the classification system, because species can be so plastic and there can be all this hybridization. So I think that's why I say at the start, saying that you've seen every single species, I'm not sure it's right. I think you just want to see as many different ones as you can.
Yeah, some of the mannequin orchids, I think the monkey lady, military man orchid, I just do wonder some of the sites whether what you have on them isn't just a real hybrid mix-up. And it made me think that what it was you had was just something that was moving through, like it wasn't a species, it was just a change. And something like a musk orchid, which I think is pretty distinctive, is very simple on its own, doesn't seem to hybridize, not surprisingly. On the other end of the spectrum, things like Dactylorhiza and some of the hybrids you get of them, you just see this great big mess of stuff moving through and changing, and you wonder what it's going to be like in 20 or 30,000 years time.
I think in light of what you're saying, Ken, is that I'm going to invite Leif Sweden to come and talk to us. And originally I thought we'd get him to come and talk about his new book, but his PhD has been on the hybridization of the mannequin orchids in Europe. And well, we'd perhaps kill off the GNS members by getting him to come and talk about hybridization in orchids. But if we got him here to talk about something else, then we could question him at the end about hybridization and see what he thinks. As far as I know, his paper hasn't been published yet on hybridization, so we have to wait for that. But he's obviously had time to write a book in the meantime, so he must have some results somewhere. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, I'm so out of the loop that the whole idea of the species.
I think I was watching a YouTube video from him, and he talked about hybridization, and then you realize that if some of these hybrids are fertile, that you get this regression thing going, and then it crosses with something else. So it really makes you wonder what on earth is the DNA in any of them, really. It just must be such a mess.
Yeah, well, I think I sort of muttered at one point about some of the hybrids that all this thing about naming hybrids amuses me.
Me too.
Because I'm assuming that the hybrid name can only go for the F1 hybrid. That is the first hybrid after two separate parents. And as you know, if you go to somewhere like what's the woods just outside Cheltenham by the reservoir?
Downswell.
Downswell.
Yeah, if you go into Downswell Woods, as you know, there are orchids there, there are hellebrines there that you just cannot decide. Are they violet hellebrines? Are they broad-leaved hellebrines? Are they the hybrid between the two? And when you look at them, obviously they're both species have been there for a long time, and regression has occurred. That I don't think any of them are genuine F1 hybrids. I think they're hybrids that have then, because they're fertile, have mixed either with the parent species or with the other hybrids to produce a further form where the genes are further mixed, and the characteristics can get so varied. Did I show you that one last year that was between two pine trees?
Oh yes, that's right.
No one has been able to decide what that was.
I've seen lots of people arguing about it.
That's right. No,
yeah.
Their mind what it is. And those people who stated categorically that it was a violet hellebrine, well, there was no way that it was a pure line violet hellebrine. And it wasn't a broad-leaved hellebrine either. It was too easy to say what it wasn't, and almost impossible to say what it was. So.
There was a very good YouTube presentation by I forgot the chap's name now, about hellebrines, and saying just this, that like with some of the others, it's just something which is changing and moving through. But of course, once you bring in modern DNA, you see that lots of the old namings and things are, or people, the way people thought 30 years ago, it's not true.
A chap called Rich Malkuriak has written papers for the Hardy Orchid Society about hybridization in the hellebrines. And I sent pictures of various hellebrines from Dowdswell last year to him. And he ended up by saying it's very difficult to say what they are. Yeah, but I do find it interesting, you see, that in the woods in Gloucestershire, and I haven't looked widely enough through Britain to say whether this is true or not, but somewhere like Hales Wood, where there are no broad-leaved hellebrines, the violet hellebrines are really distinctive and obvious as violet hellebrines. And I think it's King Stanley or something like that. There are no broad-leaved hellebrines, just violets. No, Leonard Stanley, I think it is. And again, the violet hellebrines, just like the ones in Haleswood, textbook violet hellebrines. But then when you get into woods like lower woods, there are some parts of the wood where there are just violet hellebrines, and they are obvious violet hellebrines. But there are other parts of lower wood where there are broad-leaved hellebrines as well. And then you're not so sure. Some of the violet hellebrines look a bit odd, and some of the broad-leaved hellebrines look a bit odd. And there are a couple of plants that are obviously hybrids between the two. And Dowdswell is a classic in that case, because in 2019, I think it was, Duncan found some perfect violet hellebrines in Dowdswell. But then if you think about the ones that were along the edge of the reservoir, not so obvious, were they?
No.
Some of them are quite obviously more violet hellebrine, and some are more obviously more broadleaved. But I suspect that in Dowdswell, the two species have been living alongside each other for a long time, and as you say, there's just a complete mix in there. Very confusing place. Probably best not to go there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, we're rambling on. Does anyone else have anything they want to comment on, or by all means, call Ken and I a couple of nutcases if you like. Dave.
Just, in case I miss saying it, just wanted to say, apart from an amazing year orchid hunting, tremendous standard of photos, and thanks very much for all the presentation and hard work that went into that, because I know that took a long time. So thanks very much.
Oh, well, thanks for that, Dave. But like I say, it was never intended as a presentation. It was more my record. What I'm not sure about doing now is whether to put it into paper form so that I've got a permanent record on the shelf of it. But it's a lot of pages, so I'm not sure. It could be the most expensive booklet in the world, couldn't it?
I had a question, Mervyn.
Okay, Kate. Yeah.
I was wondering if you thought the variation in patterns on some of the orchids had any influence on their pollination success, or whether it was just random side effect.
Wow. I mean, that's
But where
really
the pollinator
interesting.
exists still.
Right. Well, the only ones that I'm aware of where there isn't a known pollinator for the insect pollinated flowers are the late spider and the bee orchid. The bee orchid has coped with that by being self-pollinating. And I've got some pictures where you can see the pollinia when they're fresh, and then when it's decided, oh, I'm not going to get insect pollinated, and the pollinia are growing around in ready to touch the stigma. The late spider orchid hasn't coped with there not being a pollinator, and that's why it's so rare and probably right outside its range here in this country. But going back to your question, what we see in those photographs, I don't think is the same as what the bees
True.
or wasps or other insects see. I mean, it's interesting that lots of the patterns, the loops, the dots, the lines are in that purple, and they're right at that end of the light spectrum beyond which things like bees can see what we can't see. So it'd probably be quite interesting to get some sort of camera that will take beyond the ultraviolet or turn ultraviolet into something we could see. I think you're absolutely right. Those patterns are there for a reason. And in the things that are purely white, for example, do they get visited as much as the ones that have got patterning on the leaves? So things like the purely white common spotted orchid, I'm now going to go and look at it at weekly intervals, I think, next year, and see if the pollinia do get moved. It's such a distinct group of plants. You know, it's the same plant year after year after year, you know, and they're there for several weeks. I think I would, and that's certainly something that Sean Cole does. He visits plants regularly to see if they've been pollinated and see if he can get pictures of pollinators. And that's going to be my next project. I've started doing it with some of them where I've happened upon pollinators, but I think now it's going to be a case of deciding one or two species each year and just sitting next to the plants at the peak of their pollinia production and just sit there and wait and wait and wait. I've got a couple of nice pollination pictures. I remember Juliet commented on one that I posted. She couldn't believe that this beetle was covered in pollinia, could you? That was so. But going back to your question, I don't really know, but I think it must have an influence.
Is there any chance that with evolution, the patterns could adapt for the spider orchids to suit a native, like, pollinator?
Well, I suspect there will be some accidental insect pollination anyway, because when you do sit and watch some of these flowers, all sorts of things are bumbling their way through them. So, for example, when you're photographing, or when I'm photographing some of them, I have the tripod set up, the camera set up, and sometimes you're waiting for the light to change or whatever. And sometimes you're waiting for a bloody spider to get out of the way, or some ants to get out of the way. And I keep threatening to take a paintbrush with me so that I can remove the cobwebs and remove the spiders out of the flowers. Because they completely wreck some of the pictures sometimes, and you've spent ages setting it up, taking the picture, you haven't noticed they're there, and you get home and there's a bloody spider right in the middle of the flower or whatever. So there's going to be pollinators that are accidentally pollinating these things, not necessarily.
Things like bee orchids, do they produce pheromones as well?
No, I don't think they do. I suspect that's why they haven't managed to attract anything else, and that's probably the reason for the late spider not attracting anything either. I think they depend totally on visual. And as you probably know, the fly orchid, the digger wasp that pollinates it, doesn't look anything like the flower. And it's the pheromones that actually confuse it and fool it into pseudo-copulating with it. So that definitely does produce pheromones. But as far as I'm aware, I don't think the bee orchids do.
So why bother looking like it does if it doesn't need it?
I suspect.
Is it wasting resources putting a
isn't
flower?
about things being bothered or deliberately.
No, I was just wondering if that would
it's
disappear.
just part of evolution to give us pleasure.
It could be. It's also the fact that in geological time, it's probably still a relatively short time that it's been here without a pollinator. I mean, we keep judging. It's like this shifting baseline syndrome of saying, well, there were lots of birds around when I was a boy, but that's not the baseline. The baseline you should perhaps be going back to is the last ice age or something like that. Big discussion I've been having with the curlew people recently as to whether curlews should even be in Gloucestershire. So, but there we are. Depends where you draw your baseline. And I discovered the other day that they're using the 1970s as their baseline for how many curlews there should be. And it would appear from all the data that the 70s were a ridiculously high peak in numbers of curlews. So should you use the peaks as your baseline for population studies, or should you use troughs? Who knows?
You talked about a lot about hybridization for variation in these things, but what about environmental factors? I'm thinking sort of hydrangeas, depending on which type of soil you grow them on. Is there anything like that? Do you think?
Well, some of these variants that are around the country, some people are referring to them as ecotypes. And my understanding of ecotype is that it is the same species, but is becoming subtly adapted to a different habitat. And that, of course, is possibly the preliminary stage to speciation, because if they become sufficiently different over thousands of years and therefore stop being compatible with others of the same species but are geographically separated, then you'll have two separate species. But at the moment, a number of these things, as I say, have been referred to as ecotypes and are basically the same species. Does that answer it?
Yeah, it makes it more confusing to identify them.
I mean, I suppose the most obvious way of looking at it as well is if you think about the pictures I showed you of the heath spotted on a nice neutral to slightly acidic soil in mid Wales, the heath spotteds grow sort of 18 inches tall with some of the inflorescences containing sort of 50, 60 flowers. Whereas in the Burren, on that slightly alkaline soil on the limestone, where you wouldn't expect heath spotteds to grow, the plants were stunted. and probably only had maybe 15 to 20 flowers on the inflorescence. So that's obviously going to be environmental influence on the plant growing.
It's a tougher climate there as well, isn't it? West coast of Ireland.
Well, it is, but the Irish marsh orchids are luxuriant. And they're growing at the same distance from the coast. They're experiencing the same wind, the same salt spray. I mean, those particularly small ones were literally 50 meters from the tops of the cliffs. So, you know, they were exposed to sea spray and wind. And yet alongside them, there were early purple orchids, which like the alkaline soil or slightly alkaline soil. And there were probably more and more luxuriant early purple orchids than you've ever seen in your life. I mean, the Burren was purple with them. Absolutely stunning. Yeah. If you like early purple orchids, go to the Burren. It's brilliant. The problem I've got is that there's no cafes and no Marks and Spencers there, so dragging Karen back will be almost impossible. But I can thoroughly recommend those of you, the botanists amongst you, at least once in your life, you've got to go to the Burren. Now that I've discovered it, it's just amazing, absolutely amazing.
I think it's got a Collins New Naturalists book all to itself, hasn't it?
Yes, yeah.
From what I remember, about that thick. Yeah.
But then so is the Wye Valley, and we've got the person who wrote the New Naturalist on the Wye Valley coming to speak to us. I think I haven't quite firmed the date down yet. It'll either be the end of November or beginning of December that he comes. But it's a chap called George Peterkin. You must know him, David. You're muted.
Yeah, I met George quite a few times. So met him during the summer again when I did a bat walk down at Brockweir as well. So he came along for that.
Yeah, I mean, he's interested in all aspects of woodland life, basically, isn't he?
Yeah.
And he's edging towards doing a general woodland talk. But what I really want him to do is to talk about Lady Park wood, because he knows the individual trees and he knows their growth rates, and he knows that some of them are still suffering from the 1976 drought, and things like that. He has got an amazing knowledge about the individual trees in Lady Park. So I'm going to try and persuade him to make that a large element of his talk.
Because he wrote 2 New Naturalist series, didn't he?
Yes, he's got 2. Yeah. I've only got the Wye Valley one, but I mean, we're fortunate in having so many people that have done good things in Gloucestershire, you know, like yourself with the bats, George with the trees. There's various other people that we've had and that we will have to talk to us. So
it's a bit worrying on that score, though, that we haven't got the sort of commitment from a lot of the younger ones. I know we've got a few like Kate, but we're sort of really lacking on some things, aren't we? Like spiders and things again.
Yes, yeah. It's a great worry, and it's something we've discussed in committee as well, what we can do to try and encourage recorders of the future. I mean, when you think about the age of our recorders, a number of them are coming to the end of their field work. You know, it's
we are.
Well, I mean, I feel much the same with ringing, Dave, because I mean, I've just completed 25 years of CES at Ashleworth, and really I want someone to take it over from me. And I've said to a couple of the younger ringers, you know, I'm quite happy to come and help you, but what I want is to occasionally have a week off and disappear during May so that I can do more things like go to Ireland and Scotland and things. Because although this year I did them as short visits, really when you go to Scotland, you really want to go there for 2 weeks to justify traveling that far. And the same with Cumbria. You don't want to go there just for a day like I did the Cliburn Moss trip. I mean, that was absolutely crazy. And when you think Aviemore is just over 500 miles away, we drove there in one day, stopping in Cumbria on the way. We had 2 full days in that area, and then we drove all the way back. And if it hadn't been a sort of year for ticking things, I would never have considered it. But like I say, what I've now got is a list of places I want to go to and stay there for a couple of weeks. And again, having discovered the Caledonian forest in that area of the Cairngorms. The Cairngorm is the mountain that I couldn't remember earlier on as well. The Cairngorm. Yeah, I mean, I just want to go and spend some time there. The birds are fantastic. The forest is fantastic. And the beer's quite nice, and the food's quite nice. I like haggis. Yeah. Our next talk is going to be Ellen Winter talking about the HabiMap project that GWT are doing, and I was rather hoping that Andy would be here tonight, because I'm hoping that he will do the talk on the end of October and get him to talk to us about the marsh warbler. But because I'm not sure I can get internet connection for that last one, because I'll be on St Agnes, and everyth's a bit intermittent there, electricity supply, internet signal, everything. So and hopefully, Andy, you're going to host that evening, aren't you, for me?
Yeah, is that October or November?
October, yeah.
I've got that down as October.
Yeah, that's it.
So when is Ellen Winter?
The first Wednesday in October.
Ah. Yep.
And then what I thought we would do is we'll have I've got 2 speakers lined up for November, but I thought, well, I'd use just one of them in November, and then we'd have a members evening talking about pollination, not orchids though, okay? And get people to bring their pictures along of flowers and their pollination mechanisms. And I know there's at least one member who, like me, discovered the spurges this year and the weird pollination technique that they've got, which will be worth having a discussion about and looking at. And so I've got those 2 speakers lined up. Then we've got the Christmas edition, when we'll have I think everybody enjoyed having a photographic competition, didn't they? So we can do that again. If Philip and Helen are still listening, might you be judges again?
Sorry, Mervyn, frantically trying to unmute. Yes, that would be fine.
or would you rather I got another judge so that you 2 can enter the competition?
No, it's all right.
No, they'd win.
No, the embarrassment would be if we didn't.
Do you know, that's always the case with professional photographers, isn't it? They're afraid to enter competitions.
Sorry, I've just realised you can't see me. So yes, no, that'd be fine, Mervyn.
Are you sure? Oh, that's good. Thank you. That means I'll confirm it with an email anyway. But and we'll
Phil's just saying we'll do it if you'll run a field trip next year looking for orchids.
Oh yeah, no problem. Yeah.
There we are then.
And then the payback after that will be that he can do the talk he's doing for Dursley for GNS.
No problem.
He's saying no problem. So there we are.
Yeah, good, excellent. Oh well, that's I'm starting to build up a list of people ready for next year as well. So
it's not very Gloucestershire related though.
We're having to move slightly further afield to keep the meetings going. So, I mean, we are lucky that there is so much that happens in Gloucestershire that we can have a lot of Gloucestershire input. But yeah, it's good. Yeah. Going back to Helen, to the you know, I asked, in fact, Barry's there as well. We never did see anything from the Foresters Forest about helping you out. It's I don't know whether the rest of you realise, but
No.
Helen have retired from running the meetings in the forest, which were lovely meetings. Even my wife enjoyed coming to them. So.
Even though there wasn't a Marks and Spencer's.
I think it was the cup of tea and biscuit, to be honest with you.
No, it was a shame because it was raised at a couple of meetings, like getting to the end of the Foresters Forest, and does anybody that's been volunteering want to help? And nobody came forward. And then Rosie Kelsall was trying to get volunteers to help as well. And somebody volunteered, but then within about 3 weeks decided they didn't want to volunteer anymore, sort of thing. And we just thought, no, you know, and John and June aren't in the best of health that used to help us. So yeah, so we've decided with heavy hearts that, you know, it's come to its end really. But
I also wonder really whether you'd have got the audiences anymore as well. I mean, you'll discover when you go to Dursley, when I last went there weren't many people.
Well, Phil's already done it. And how many did you have?
Has he? How many were there?
15, he's saying. He doesn't want to be on camera. He's talking from the side here. Yeah, about 15.
He's a bit of a shy flower, isn't he?
He is. Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm actually a member, so that's why I'm keeping quiet.
I think you are. I think I'm the member, but there we go.
We don't keep a reg. Don't worry. I know there were a few people here this evening that weren't members, I think, weren't there, Barry?
Well, I don't know. I'll have to have a look.
Yeah.
I didn't pay much attention.
There were certainly a couple of names I didn't recognize.
Recording there. Hang on a minute. I'm just going to stop the recording because we're probably two and a bit hours, and then it runs out.
Okay.
So I'll stop before it runs out.
Yeah, well, we don't want all these ramblings